What is descriptive writing and why is it so challenging to agree upon an appropriate amount of description? Today we're really going to go into what descriptive writing is, starting with actually some of the terms that are used, two in particular that kind of obfuscate what we're discussing. And we're going to go into some examples as well as what can be considered at different levels descriptive writing. I'd like to start with a brief excerpt from an introduction of the book Delta of Venus by Anais Nin. It is all erotica. The situation is that she's working for a client who's continually asking her to reduce the amount of description or the poetic descriptions in the work. And I just love her encapsulation of this. So the quote begins, "I began to write tongue-in-cheek to become outlandish, inventive, and so exaggerated that I thought he would realize I was caricaturing sexuality, but there was no protest. I spent days in the library studying the Kama Sutra, listening to friends' most extreme adventures. Less poetry," said the voice over the telephone, "be specific." But did anyone ever experience pleasure from reading a clinical description? Didn't the old man know how words carry colors and sounds into flesh? So the reason I'm starting with this quote is because I think it does encapsulate kind of the main debate over descriptive writing and how descriptive you should be. And that's something that's going to kind of leak into the rest of the examples and will likely weave into conversations that if you're not already having it online, you probably are. So is less more when we see in American literature, modern American literature specifically, we tend to take a Hemingway approach. It should be brief. It should be specific, as the voice over the telephone says. It should not have any poetic nuance, or that should be limited, which is vastly specific as a style and can very much limit range. At the same time, it is easy to go overboard in writing, especially if you're someone who prefers to write a lot and cut down later. I like to write less and build up personally. So what are the two, in my opinion, the two things that have really contributed to this kind of misunderstanding of description and this overemphasis on simplistic writing? There's a couple things. One is the media literacy and declining rate, I would say, of reading, especially in the content world. We're saying, I was taught, 8 years ago that you're writing for people who don't like to read. People might have a 5th or 6th grade reading level, and so there's the simplistic dumbing down, essentially, or oversimplification of writing styles. But I do think it's a cultural subset that has just been really popular over the past century or so. So to start with, what are terms that we need to kind of look into more deeply when we're talking about descriptive writing? The first is purple prose. Purple prose is defined as any kind of prose that takes attention away from the narrative. It's often described or used for paragraphs or sentences that are ornate or overemphasized descriptions. And I would say that's an accurate definition from my time over the past 15 years in the fan fiction community. That's where I first heard it. If there's too much description over a certain aspect, people will say, oh, that's purple prose. And that just might be because they have, not necessarily because it's taking attention away from the narrative, it's because that person actually has a limited interest in descriptions. Each reader is different, right? I mean, let's look at Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Would we call that purple prose? Because he has extensive descriptions of the cathedral, but it's all leading towards a certain point, which is serving the history and education of the cathedral architecture, which is central to the narrative. It's not necessarily plot-driven, but it does meet the goals that Victor Hugo is trying to accomplish. And just to provide more context for that, here is kind of a snippet of Chapter 1 from the Great Hall of the Palace of Justice, January 6, 1482, so-and-so. It continues, and this goes on for like 8 paragraphs. That is essentially description of the day. In the morning, the avenues leading up to the Palace of Justice were particularly crowded. It's just this constant description, and we see this a lot in his style. I think today this would definitely be considered purple prose. Like, I can see an editor saying this should be 2 paragraphs at most, not 8. It is way too much information for readers. But let's be frank, there are people who really enjoy elaborate descriptions that helps them immerse in the creative world, especially for anything that's not modern day. And so there is a sense of genre to it as well. For example, I really enjoy fantasy. I don't like a lot of fantasy authors because there is extensive description, I think more than is necessary in some cases. But I think fantasy and science fiction especially warrant more explanation than, let's say, a romantic comedy set in New York. So I don't like the term purple prose because I think it's kind of bandied about too much. I think if it's used, it's really important to consider what is the purpose of the descriptions. Does it actually support the narrative, even if it's long, does it match genre expectations? These are things that matter more than necessarily the length of just all descriptions and putting a blanket standard over it. The other kind of vague critique term that I find very unuseful these days is show don't tell. This is very common advice to use sensory details and clear character actions to move the story forward. A good example that's incorporated in many textbooks about this rule is Anton Chekhov's quote, "Don't tell me the moon is shining, show me the glint of light on broken glass." Now, showing is often, but not always, in the active voice and typically adds to your word count. And I have a lot of typos in the sheet today. Excuse me with that. But yes, showing is often a great way to extend your word count. It adds more immersion, sensory details. It's description, actually, at the end of the day, more than telling, which is very simplified. But it can be overused because some people can't determine when to use telling, I think is the most common problem. Because telling is not wrong. It also helps you keep things manageable. If you tried to describe every single action, every single description, it would be unreadable. And in fact, telling is also a cultural device. I would say there's a lot more what we would call telling in English in German literature than there is in American literature, English literature. It's important to use these things in tandem. You don't want to overshow. You don't want to overtell. So I think show don't tell is often just it's a nuanced topic that, like purple prose, gets easily misused because it's something we all hear in Beginners 101, and it's very easy to lean on that for why we don't like something when we're critiquing someone else's work. We can't figure out what exactly is a problem with a passage, because there are definitely times where show don't tell can seem to be an answer when you're editing, and there might be another device or a way to word it that's more important. Sometimes it's a rhythm issue, there's consistency issues, there's simply irrelevancy. If we want to talk about real purple prose and description, if something is irrelevant, it just shouldn't exist. And in my case, I tend to be more brief. I write up rather than write down when I'm revising. And so a lot of times I'll turn a telling statement into a showing one as I determine what's more critical to the overall atmosphere and feeling of the story. So this is something that probably deserves its own video, but I thought it was important to discuss here. Now, what makes a bad description? I'm actually not going to reinvent the wheel here. I'm going to talk about a blog from Kirsten Lamb, who's fantastic. In her blog, which you can see here, The Good, the Bad, and Please Just Stop, is fantastic. She talks about repetition, so using like huge and big in the same sentence or the same paragraph to describe the same object. Captain Obvious clauses, the fire was hot, was an example, I think. Bland descriptions of character attributes, weathers, locations, and info dumps. These are all things that slow down the pace, and it's just poor word efficiency, poor space efficiency. Repetition and Captain Obvious clauses especially, they come out a lot in the first draft. I would say once you finish draft one, go through and just repeat anything that's repetitive or the moments, right? Bland descriptions can be a little bit more nuanced, but I would say things like sticking to very basic statements. She was blonde. It was sunny out, where there's no sense of rhythm or atmosphere being created. There's no tone, it's just a blank statement. Info dumps may or may not be descriptive, but that's definitely just a matter of poor writing, right? That's almost the main example of show don't tell. A lot of telling is info dumps. So if you can avoid that, um, that would be ideal. Granted, info dumping is not weaving in details about the character throughout the story, and that's something we can look at in more detail with descriptions. Again, everything is going to depend on how you can pull it off in the story. This is what makes writing somewhat challenging to standardize, because you can break these rules and create a very successful narrative, but you can't break them unless you're aware of them, obviously. So I'm probably going to look at one or two examples from this sheet and then do independent examples, just to make sure that these videos don't become too long. So what is an example of good writing descriptions? Descriptions vary. There are many ways outside of, it's not just a list of adjectives, right? It's adding extensive detail to something specific. So for the first example, I'd like to talk about a novel called Forgottenness. It is, I believe, translated from Ukrainian. I'll read the passage very quickly. Lipinski had never experienced anything like this, so he wasn't sure if what he was feeling was love. That's really the thesis of this paragraph, right? It's focused entirely on elaborating on the description of love and why he thinks it may or may not be love, because it's a new experience for him. So if love was fear, devastating, longing, nausea, obsession, then yes, he was in love. But why then was love so exalted? So we see in this description juxtaposed, I'll just say opposing ideas of love. We don't think of love as longing and nausea. Obsession is not a form of love, but it's something that he's conflating with it because it is a new emotion. He has no idea how to describe what love is outside of this. And then we also see a question. Why was love so exalted? Followed by another. Why was it imbued with the meaning of life and treated like a cult when instead it should be treated as a disease? I've seen in recent years, especially, this move away from using rhetorical questions, but I think it is a useful device, especially when you have a concept that's littered by uncertainty, right? The entire paragraph is about Lipinski's unfamiliarity with this emotion. So having questions makes sense, and it adds to that feeling of confusion. In Lipinski's view, that's what it was, a disease filled with suffering, an extremely dangerous one, an incurable one. So in here we have different rhythms. We have longer sentences followed by short, and then a couple short at the end. We have this transition from the concept of love into the visualization of disease. This is a fantastic small description, and there are many long ones in this, in my set of examples we'll eventually get to. It seems like an unnecessary deviation from the plot, which is much about how Lipinski is focused on maintaining his identity as Ukrainian, and there's a couple other key facets to the plot, but I would say identity is definitely central during a period of upheaval. But we have this plot that's going on, and we're taking this full paragraph, several sentences, to try to decode his confusion about this concept that should be a universal one. It may seem at first glance unnecessary, but it adds to kind of the sense of, I want to say tumultuousness. I can't speak today. But this kind of wild, uncertain time that he's living in as well. I think it's very thematic, essentially. The description mirrors a theme, even if it doesn't progress the plot per se. And it gives us critical insight into the character's perspective as well. So this is an example of a description that's using some things that are not as, I would say, supported anymore, such as the use of rhetorical questions throughout the piece, but it's a very good, I think, example of a description that works and could be emulated. And I'll do one more for contrast. There are a ton of descriptions in here that are very long, and those are the ones I want to talk about because that's where we kind of can discuss, is it purple prose, should things be told, so on and so forth. But I think this is a good place to stop after this example. This is from the novel V by Vasilikos Vasilis. Vasilis Vasilikos. It's a Greek translated novel, and I'll read the passage. And if one person had been missing, nothing would have been altered. Even if 10, 100, 1,000 persons had been missing, the body of the people come to restore their hero to life would have remained insoluble. So first off, we already break a rule here. We have missing and missing here. Again, you can use repetition for the sense of rhythm, or there's a word for it. My brain will get there. It's not necessarily parallelism in this case, but it can add emphasis. So it's being used strategically here. This was the soul's consolation. Her body had served to bring about a sudden unbreakable union of numbness of numberless human molecules. So be it. What she had lost, the others had gained 100-fold. And the idea of peace, for which one body had been sacrificed, suddenly became flesh and blood in the rarefied air. The same immortality that flooded the streets flooded also the hearts of men. The sea is inexhaustible. It is full of unexploitable riches. It will not dry up. When you learn from your small boat and draw a pail of water, the sea is what never ends. So, looking at this as a whole, it's very abstract. So Z is a political novel. We're talking about the death, and there's a lot of metaphysical stuff later on, of a political leader leading a student protest who is killed. And it's based off a true story. This is, I think, the one previous to that one as well. I have some specific tastes, apparently. But it's very abstract. We do bring in description to make those abstract terms more tangible to the reader, to this feeling of reincarnation through a movement, almost the survival of the soul that feeds all of who that soul touched, right? The sea is inexhaustible. Normally I'm not crazy about water metaphors, but I think this does a really good job of it. Even the idea of peace, how we can meet peace through this kind of sacrifice that the character had made. So you're having these larger concepts, but you're bringing in descriptive terms to make it easier to digest, to give it that feeling of volume, of fullness, to emphasize the act. It's not at all advancing to the next part, right? But it's telling you the impact of this action. Granted, and this is one thing with talking about descriptive writing, it's hard to talk about description without the context of the rest of the story. This is one paragraph and a line of paragraphs, in the same way we saw that The Hunchback of Notre Dame chapter 1 was 8 paragraphs of description. It's worth doing a video that's almost a chapter of a book if we're just talking about descriptive writing, of going through by through. But this is also a great example of how description can be used to thematically connect the reader on an emotional level to the plot, to the characters, to the ideas that are driving the plot. This is where we have the idea that you cannot have just clinical descriptions and have a successful book. It's one of the reasons why AI written descriptions tend to flop. There's that lack of understanding these interconnected webs of experiences and tapping into the senses. So this is one other example that's kind of in line with the one before. I have several lined up I'll be doing separate videos on because they are just frankly really long. If I'm going to sum up this video, when we talk about descriptive writing serves a lot of purposes. It tells us about the character. It tells us about the theme. It connects us emotionally to every scene, to the ideas, to the internal thoughts of the characters. There's a lot of ways that descriptive writing can be used to enhance. It can detract if you are engaging in purple prose and just writing nonstop on the same topic for 12 paragraphs, even 3 paragraphs may be too long. If you don't balance showing and telling, it can become cumbersome. It takes practice. It's not perfect. Sometimes you're going to cut a lot. I would say 90% of the time you're going to cut a lot, and that's okay. I feel like writing the descriptions out, even if 90% of it gets cut at the end, helps us to better, um, I want to say internalize, but that's not the correct word. Sorry, I'm a little slow today, but it really helps us to get to think through the entirety of what we're writing. And so even if 90% gets cut, you'll reach that end destination. It's okay to remove. I would say don't just automatically agree with editors or beta readers or anybody that something should be removed, because there is a subjective nature to it. You really have to go through and ask, are you committing any of these bad description fallacies unnecessarily? Are you over repeating information? Are you making statements that are just dumb moments? How bland or creative are those descriptions? Can you spice any of them up? Are any of them info dumps that can be written out and shown in full scenes? And then I would say the main thing is making sure that every paragraph, every word, every sentence contributes to the story that you're trying to tell. And if you follow that rule specifically, you're going to avoid a lot of purple prose and write really solid descriptions, especially in the revision process. I hope this was helpful. Do let me know in the comments. I don't have a specific exercise for this initial draft. I would say definitely go through any current work you have and tell me, in the comments, were you able to pick out anything that could be purple prosy, that could be show don't tell, that could, be a substandard description? Were you able to update any descriptions into something that was, uh, you know, a little bit more lively and more vivid? And if so, you could post some of those samples. I think I'll be doing the same. I'm doing some writing right now. So, yeah, thank you for joining me on this intro to descriptive writing. I'll have a couple more examples out pretty soon. And have a good day.